if you do not want to go to a nursing home, grab your suitcase and get out of my house. The words of my son, Richard, echoed against the walls like thunder in the middle of a storm. For a few seconds, time stood still. His voice, so much like his mother's when she was angry, pierced my chest with the same force that shatters a porcelain vase. Only this time, I was the vase. I looked at him without answering. His eyes were no longer those of the little boy who used to run toward me with open arms after school, but those of a man hardened by arrogance, ambition, and ingratitude. Behind him, Valerie, his wife, watched him with her arms crossed, wearing that freezing smile she always showed when something satisfied her. "Come on, Richard," she said. "Do not make it any harder. Your father will understand. He can no longer live alone. Your father," that is what she called me. Not Dad, not Robert, not even my father-in-law. Just your father. As if I were a burden, a useless piece taking up space in her spotless Upper East Side apartment. I remained silent. Not out of fear or resignation, but because I understood that any words would be useless. I had spent too many years screaming in silence, begging for love with my eyes, hoping for gratitude in a home that was no longer mine. So I took a deep breath, forced a smile, and said in a calm voice, "All right, son, if that is what you want, I will leave." Valerie sighed with relief, as if she had just freed herself from an uncomfortable obligation. Richard lowered his eyes. Maybe he was ashamed, or maybe he was relieved too. I would never know. I slowly climbed the stairs, feeling heavier than the suitcase I had not even begun to pack. Every step was a memory. The scuff mark from Richard's shoe when he was learning to climb them. The handrail that Evelyn, my late wife, had varnished. The smell of wood and the past. All of it belonged to me. But I had nothing left. I entered my room and looked around. The mirror gave me back the reflection of a man with gray hair, deep wrinkles, and a gaze that was more tired than sad. On the dresser, Evelyn's portrait remained in its place. I picked it up carefully, wiped the dust off with the edge of my shirt, and whispered, "Do you see what we achieved? Evelyn, a son with his own apartment, a wife, money, and an empty heart." I pulled the old leather suitcase out of the closet. It was not big, but it was enough for what was left of my life. I folded each piece of clothing with an almost ritualistic calm. A white shirt, 2 pairs of pants, the hand-knit blanket my mother had made before she died, and a pair of worn-out shoes. My shoes, at the bottom, I tucked away a small wooden box containing my pocket watch, and the letters Evelyn had written to me when we were young. On top, I placed a photo album, the only witness to years that were fading away like dry leaves. As I closed the suitcase, I heard Richard and Valerie laughing in the living room. They were planning a dinner for that night. I, apparently, was an obstacle that had to disappear before the guests arrived. I swallowed hard and felt a lump in my throat, but I did not cry anymore. My tears had dried up the day I realized that children do not always love the way parents hope they will. An hour later, I went downstairs with my suitcase in hand. Silence filled the apartment. Richard was standing by the door, avoiding my eyes. Valerie, on the other hand, wore that expression that mixed fake pity with satisfaction. "Do you have everything, Dad?" he finally asked. "Yes, son, everything I need. The car is going to take you to the facility. I already spoke with the director. It is a good place. You are going to like it." Facility, another pretty word to disguise abandonment. I watched him in silence. memorizing every feature of his face, every line of his expression. I did not want to remember him like this. But the heart does not choose what it keeps. When I opened the door to leave, a noise broke the tension. The engine of a powerful vehicle stopped right in front of the building. Richard frowned. "What kind of car is that?" We walked over to the window. A black limousine had pulled up to the door, gleaming under the afternoon sun. The driver, wearing a dark suit and white gloves, stepped out and walked in my direction. "Mr. Robert?" he asked respectfully. "Yes." "That is me? I am here to pick you up." "Mr. Alexander Sanders asked me to escort you." The color drained from my son's face. "Alexander Sanders," he repeated in disbelief. "Yes," the driver replied. "He said you would know what this is about." I smiled softly. I remembered that name. It was a name from the past that had marked my youth with affection and promises I had not been able to keep. Destiny, as unpredictable as ever, was bringing him back just as life was trying to erase me. Richard looked at me, completely confused. Valerie's jaw dropped. "What is going on?" "Dad," I grabbed my suitcase, took a deep breath, and answered, "Nothing. A son? Just that the nursing home waiting for me is much bigger than you imagined." The driver opened the limousine door. Before getting in, I turned back to Richard. "Take care of this apartment. Richard, one day, you will understand what you lost." I stepped through the door without looking back. The sun hit my face, and the wind rustled my white hair. For the first time in many years, I did not feel old. I felt free. The car door closed, and the engine purred softly. As we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw my son standing on the sidewalk, frozen, watching his father disappear in a limousine he never could have imagined. I smiled peacefully. Destiny had just taken its first step. The limousine moved slowly down the interstate, leaving behind the neighborhood where I had lived for the last 30 years of my life. I looked out the tinted window, watching the trees blur and the buildings grow more distant, like memories fading into the background. The silence inside the car was so deep that I could hear my own heartbeat. The driver, a man with grayish hair and flawless manners, watched me through the rearview mirror. "Mr. Sanders asked me to take you directly to his estate," he said kindly. "He is very anxious to see you." I nodded without saying a word. My throat felt tight, as if the words had been stuck there for years. Alexander Sanders. I had not heard that name in over 40 years. I met him when I was 22, in a time when life still seemed generous and friendships felt like certainties. But poverty, responsibilities, and decisions that cannot be undone had pulled us apart. I had never heard from him again, although sometimes, on sleepless nights, his memory would visit me with the sweetness of an old perfume. The car stopped in front of a wrought iron gate. On the other side laid a property that looked like it belonged in another world. A vast, beautifully landscaped garden, a gravel driveway, and a massive estate with huge windows that reflected the sky of upstate New York. The driver stepped out, opened my door, and offered his hand. As I placed my foot on the ground, I felt like I was crossing not just an entrance, but a destiny. A man was waiting at the door. When I saw him, my heart skipped a beat. His hair was completely white, his face lined with wrinkles. But he had the same eyes, those warm, steady eyes that had once promised me the world. "Robert," he said in a whisper that pierced my soul. I could not move. I just looked at him, trying to recognize, through the shadows of time, the young man who had once offered me a rose at the downtown farmers market. telling me my smile was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Alexandre, I finally answered. We looked at each other for a few seconds, as if the past were weighing down on us. But there was no regret. He took a step toward me and hugged me. It was not a hug of romance or passion, but a hug of recognition, the kind that says, "Finally, I looked for you for years," he told me with a trembling voice. "Why, Alexander?" I asked softly. "Because there are things time cannot erase. I found out what happened with your son. I heard it all in the local news. An old neighbor of mine mentioned it. And when I heard your name, I felt destiny knocking on my door. I lowered my eyes again, feeling ashamed, not because I had been kicked out, but because of the pain of knowing someone else had witnessed my humiliation. He took my hand. "You have nothing to be ashamed of, Robert. The ones who should be ashamed are the people who did this to you." Those words were so simple and so necessary that I had to look away so he would not see my tears. It had been years since anyone had spoken to me with tenderness. I had forgotten what it felt like. We walked into the house. The interior was elegant but cozy. Plush rugs, the scent of fresh flowers, antique paintings. Nothing flashy. Everything was balanced, as if his wealth was not for showing off, but a refuge. A young housekeeper welcomed us with freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries. Alexander motioned for me to sit by the fireplace. "This house is too big for a single man," he said with a melancholy smile. "Loneliness sometimes makes more noise than the wind." "I know that too well," I replied. He sat across from me and looked at me fondly. "You know, you have not changed as much as you think." "You have?" I joked. "Now you look like a CEO straight out of a soap opera." He laughed, and his laugh was exactly the same as before, the kind that lit up everything around him. For a moment, I felt young again. We spent hours talking. He told me he had been a widower for over 10 years, that he had never had children, and that he had dedicated his life to building a company now run by his partners. "But money, Robert," he said with a sigh, "cannot buy peaceful nights or the memories you wish you could relive." I told him my story in a low voice, hiding nothing. Evelyn's illness, the years of sacrifice, the struggle of raising Richard on my own, the endless work, the times I had to be away, and finally, the betrayal. Alexander listened without interrupting. He had a steady gaze, full of compassion, but entirely free of pity. When I finished, he stayed silent for a few seconds. "You were too good," he finally said, "but you forgot about yourself. That is what parents do." I replied. "We erase ourselves so that others can exist." "Well, it is time for you to write your name again, Robert." Those words made me tremble. I did not know if it was a promise or a challenge. Maybe it was both. I settled into a bright room with a large bed and a balcony overlooking the gardens. The sound of the birds was different from my old apartment. Sweeter, less tragic. On the nightstand, I found an envelope with a handwritten note. "No one can take away what you deserve. Rest. Tomorrow we start again." I put the note in my pocket, like someone holding on to a seed, because deep in my heart, something was starting to wake up. It was not romance or hope. It was dignity. The same dignity my son had tried to rip away from me with his yelling. The same one time had failed to destroy. I turned off the light, took a deep breath, and looked out at the dark horizon. The future, for the first time in a long time, made me curious. I woke up to the sound of birds coming through the balcony. The air smelled of dew, of something I had not felt in a very long time. Freedom. For the first time in years, I did not have anyone rushing me. No list of chores waiting for me. No judgmental stare, making me feel like I was moving too slowly. Just silence, and silence, when it does not hurt, can be a blessing. I got up slowly, put on a linen robe, and walked out to the balcony. The sun caressed the surface of the gardens as if nature itself were alive and breathing. I took a deep breath. It was strange feeling peace after so much chaos. A part of me did not know what to do with it. Behind me, the door opened softly. It was Alexander, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you would be awake by now," he said in that deep, calm voice. "The birds did not let me sleep much," I replied with a smile. He handed me a cup. "Then we already have something in common. Neither the birds nor the memories let us rest." We sat together looking at the horizon. For a few minutes, we did not say anything. We just shared the silence of 2 people who do not need to fill the empty spaces with words. "You know, Alexander," I finally said, "sometimes I think the past does not age. It just waits for the right moment to return. And when it returns," he replied with sadness, "it sometimes surprises us how little we have changed on the inside." Those words made me think of Evelyn, my late wife. I did not hate her. I simply remembered her, the way you remember a passing season, with resignation. She had been a decent, hard-working woman, but she never learned to listen to me. She lived more worried about what the neighbors would say than about what her own husband felt, and I accepted it all, believing that resignation was just part of love. That morning, while Alexander went out for a meeting, I stayed alone in the living room. On the table lay an old guitar. I ran my fingers over the strings without daring to play. It had been over 30 years since I last played. When I was young, I used to play serenades in the neighborhood. It was my refuge. But when Richard was born and money started running tight, I had to sell my guitar, and my dreams went with it. I closed my eyes and plucked a string. The sound was soft, almost timid, but it woke something up inside me. Without thinking, I started playing a melody I remembered by heart. One I used to sing to Richard when he was a little boy and was afraid to sleep alone. My hands were shaking, but my soul was not. When I finished, I felt a lump in my throat. The echo of the notes mixed with my tears. They were old tears, bottled up tears, the kind you hold back out of pride or simple habit. In that moment, I knew that the past is not healed by ignoring it, but by looking it straight in the eye without fear. That afternoon, Alexander returned with a folder in his hand. "I brought something for you," he said, setting it on the table. Inside were papers, blueprints, and documents. "I am selling several properties," he explained, "and I thought you could help me manage the administration." "Me?" I asked. Surprised. I have not worked a real job in years. "Exactly why," he replied with a smile. "It is time you remember what you are worth." I did not know what to say. For decades, my life had revolved around other people. Thinking about myself felt almost selfish. But there was something in the way he looked at me, something that made me believe I still had strength left. That night, after dinner, I went up to my room with the folder under my arm. I sat at the desk and started reading. Words like property, acreage, and market value seemed like they were written in another language. But little by little, my mind started waking up. I remembered that when I was young, I was good with numbers. I used to handle all the accounting for Evelyn's business. I remembered that I used to have dreams too. I closed my eyes and smiled. It was as if a sleeping part of me was beginning to move again. Before going to bed, I looked out the window. The moon was high, and the gardens were quiet. I thought of Richard. Was he thinking of me? Was he regretting what he said? Maybe not. But it did not hurt as much anymore. The pain had started to transform into something stronger. Determination. I touched the envelope where I kept Alexander's note. No one can take away what you deserve. I smiled. Maybe, after so many years, destiny was giving me a second chance. And this time, I had no intention of wasting it. I turned off the lamp, got into bed, and before closing my eyes, I whispered, "Thank you. Alexander, thank you. Life." They say that freedom, when it comes late, has a different flavor. It does not have the sweet taste of youth, but rather a deeper, wiser, almost serene flavor. That is how I felt every morning waking up in that house, on the edge of the gardens, free, but also renewed. The days passed with a calmness I had never known. I would wake up early, brew coffee for the two of us, and then take a walk through the garden, touching the flowers with my fingertips, as if trying to make sure it was all real. Afterward, I would sit at the desk with Alexander's folder, diving deep into the paperwork, the numbers, the decisions. At first, I doubted myself. Too many years had passed following orders, asking for permission, living in the shadows of others. But little by little, I began to remember what it was like to take the reins. The brain, much like the heart, only needs a single spark to catch fire again. Alexander noticed. Sometimes, seeing me focused, he would stand quietly in the doorway, watching me with a mix of admiration and tenderness. "You are different," he told me one day, "as if time is giving you back something it stole. Maybe it is giving me back to myself." I replied. The afternoons were a different story. Alexander and I used to walk through the gardens as the sun slowly set, painting the sky a melancholic gold. He spoke little, but when he did, his words always left a mark. "Do you know what I admire about you?" "Robert," he asked one of those afternoons. "I do not know. Sometimes I think there is not much left in me to admire." He smiled. "You are wrong. You survived things that would have broken most people. And despite everything, you are still a good man." Those words moved me more than I wanted to show. I had spent so much time believing that being good was a synonym for being weak, that hearing him say that made me pause. What if goodness was not a weakness, but a strength? What if forgiveness was not surrender, but a way to look forward without letting hatred drag you under that night? I slept peacefully for the first time in many years. As the weeks passed, Alexander started delegating real responsibilities to me. I helped him review contracts, organize meetings, and make major decisions regarding his real estate. At first, his partners looked at me with suspicion, but they soon realized my intuition was sharp. "Your friend was right," one of them said to him once. "Men with experience see things that we do not." Alexander smiled. "He is not my friend. He is something much more important. He is the person who taught me how to start over." That day, I realized something. Alexander was not just offering me a job or a refuge. He was offering me respect. And after living without it for so long, that gesture was worth more than any inheritance. One morning, while reviewing bank statements, I found something that caught my attention. A property registered under a familiar last name, Mendoza. It was my apartment. The apartment Richard wanted to sell. It had been mortgaged due to a debt I never even knew existed. My heart skipped a beat. I checked the papers several times. My son had taken out a mortgage on my home and forged my signature months before kicking me out. I closed my eyes. I no longer felt rage, but an icy, clear calmness. Justice sometimes arrives in the shape of an opportunity, and this one had just knocked on my door. I took the papers to Alexander. He reviewed them carefully without saying a word. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I looked him in the eye. "I am going to take back what is mine." He nodded slowly, like someone approving a decision he was waiting to hear. "Then you can count on me. I will not stand in your way." That night, standing in front of the mirror, I looked different. My face was still lined with wrinkles. Yes, but my eyes had a new light in them. I no longer saw a fragile or broken man. I saw someone who had learned how to survive. Someone who was about to claim what was rightfully his, not out of vengeance, but for justice. I pulled an old notebook out of the closet and started writing. Every line was a piece of my story. The humiliations, the sacrifices, the lonely nights, the endless work, the times I had to be away, and finally, the betrayal. I wrote it all down, and when I finished, I added one sentence at the end. One day, the son who threw me out of my house will learn what it means to be left homeless. I closed the notebook and turned off the lamp. The wind blew through the window, bringing with it the scent of the garden and of destiny. I knew the time to return was approaching, not as the exiled father, but as the man who comes back to take his rightful place. The day my son knocked on my door, the sky was covered in gray clouds, as if the universe itself knew something uncomfortable was about to happen. I was in the living room reviewing documents when I heard the knocking at the front door. 3 loud, impatient knocks, exactly the way he used to knock when he was a kid coming home from school hungry. When I opened the door, I saw him standing there, head bowed and eyes exhausted. He was wearing a wrinkled suit. His hands were shaking, and he carried an air of defeat I had never seen in him before. For a split second, my heart squeezed. I wanted to hug him, but I remembered the words that had banished me from his home, the tears I had swallowed while folding my clothes. So I took a deep breath and said with a calm voice, "Richard, what a surprise." He raised his eyes, and upon seeing me, his expression changed instantly. He froze. I think he never imagined finding me like this, standing tall, well-dressed, elegant, carrying the kind of confidence in my eyes that he was currently lacking. "Dad," he mumbled, "I did not expect you to be here." I interrupted him calmly. "Do not worry. Denfo, life is not done with me yet." He was speechless. It was obvious he had not come to see me out of love. Something was forcing him here, something far more powerful than remorse. And even though my fatherly heart recognized everything, I decided to listen first. "Can we talk?" His eyes darted around the room with a mix of surprise and envy. The fine furniture, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the antique paintings, the pristine silence. This place had absolutely nothing to do with the cramped apartment where he had screamed at me. We sat across from each other for the first time in a long time. The power dynamic was entirely on my side. "Dad," he started, "I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I am going through a really hard time right now." "Oh, really?" I asked softly. "And when in your life have you not been going through a hard time? Sen, you have always been an expert at turning your bad decisions into my faults." He lowered his head. The silence between us was so heavy you could hear the ticking of the living room clock. "I lost my job," he continued. "Valerie. Well, she left, and I am tangled up in a huge mess with some debts." "Tangled up in a huge mess," I repeated. What an elegant way to hide the truth that I have already discovered. The mortgage, the forgery, the betrayal. What exactly are you expecting from me? "Richard," I asked with a firm voice, "I thought maybe you could help me, just for a little while." "Help you," I repeated. savoring the irony. The way you helped me when you threw me out on the street. He did not answer. His eyes watered. For a second, I thought his regret might be genuine, but a heart, once broken, learns to recognize a fake. Dad, he finally said, his voice almost begging. I made mistakes, but I am still your son, and I am still your father. I replied calmly. The difference is that I have finally learned not to let anyone disrespect me, even if they share my blood. He stood up abruptly. So you are going to deny me your help after everything I did for you? For me, I shot back. Do you want us to make a list? Richard, because if we are talking about sacrifices, mine started the day you were born. His silence was my victory. Right at that moment, Alexander walked into the living room, dressed in a sharp gray suit and carrying a folder. Forgive the interruption, he said courteously, but I need to review some company documents with Robert. Richard stared at him, his eyes wide. Company. That is right, Alexander replied serenely. Your father and I are partners in several projects. My son's face contorted. I could not tell if it was shock, jealousy, or pure rage. You are his partner, yes. So, I answered with a peaceful smile. It turns out life gave me a second chance, and I took it. Richard could not believe it. His lips moved, but no sound came out. In that instant, I understood that his pride had been completely shattered. Alexander placed the folder on the table and looked at me. When you are finished here, shall we go over the numbers? Absolutely. Alexander, thank you. As he left the room, Richard looked at me with a mix of anger and bewilderment. What kind of story is this? Dad, why didn't you tell me anything? Because you did not need to know. You turned your back on me. I did not need your approval to get back on my feet. He clenched his fists. This is not over. Of course it is not, I replied. This time, things are going to be the way they should be. I stood up and walked toward the door. You can leave. Richard, I have nothing to offer you except a piece of advice. Never humiliate someone who knows how to wait. He opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out. He walked out without saying another word. When the door closed behind him, silence filled the room once again. But this time, it was not a sad silence. It was the silence of justice beginning to take shape. I looked out the window. In the distance, the gardens continued their course, relentless, serenade, eternal, and I knew that destiny still had scores to settle. When I decided to invite them to dinner, I did not do it out of nostalgia or a desire to reconnect. I did it for justice. After all, there are some wounds that only close when you look them dead in the eye. Alexander hesitated at first. Are you sure you want to do this? Robert, he asked, looking concerned. You do not have to face them if you do not want to. I do not want to face them, I replied. I want them to look at me and see what they tried to destroy, and what they could not. That is how it happened a week later. The main dining table was set like never before. A crisp white tablecloth, tall candles, crystal glasses, and a dinner meticulously prepared by the estate's private chef. I wore a dark blue suit, understated but elegant, and the silver cufflinks that had belonged to my own father. That night, more than ever, I felt like a king receiving two vassals who did not yet realize their power was entirely gone. At 8 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. The butler opened the door and announced with a neutral voice, Mr. Richard and Mrs. Valerie. They walked in, arm in arm. She, as always, looked flawless and haughty, wearing a thin, sharp smile. He looked nervous, glancing everywhere. clearly uncomfortable with so much opulence. "Dad," he said, "you do not have to thank me," I replied softly. "Families should see each other every once in a while, even if it is just to remember where they came from." We sat down. Alexander sat beside me, calm, with that impenetrable gaze he always wore when something important was about to happen. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. Although the appearances disguised it well, Valerie faked interest in everything around her. The chandeliers, the china, the artwork. "What a beautiful house," she said in an admiring tone. "It must be such a relief for you to have someone to take care of you." "Robert," her smile was as sharp as a knife, "I do not need anyone to take care of me." "Valerie," I fired back, "I just needed someone to remind me of who I was." She laughed, but the laugh sounded hollow. Alexander intervened calmly. "Robert does not need anyone to take care of him. In fact, he helps me with everything. We are partners. You know." The silence dropped like a stone in a pond. Valerie blinked in surprise. "Partners, that is right," I answered, looking her straight in the eye. "We work together at the real estate firm. In fact, several of the biggest contracts are in my name." Richard looked at me with a mix of confusion and wounded pride. "I did not know that. You did not have to know," I replied. "There are some things you only share when people prove they deserve to hear them." The dinner continued with forced politeness. I spoke very little, simply observing. Alexander, on the other hand, steered the conversation with pure elegance. He asked about their business, about life, about their projects. Valerie answered with half-truths. I knew her too well. Her words were like expensive perfumes, pleasant on the outside, toxic on the inside. Halfway through the dinner, Alexander stood up and said, "Before dessert, I have an announcement to make." We all looked at him. He gently took my hand and spoke with a firm voice. "I have decided to permanently retire, and I want to leave all my legal and financial affairs in the hands of someone I completely trust." Robert. The silence was absolute. I could hear the beating of my own heart. Valerie choked on her wine. Richard stared at her, utterly shocked. What he managed to say. "You are leaving everything to him," Alexander smiled. "I am not leaving him anything. Richard, he earned it. He proved to have an admirable intelligence and strength. And, besides," he looked at me fondly, "he has something you lost. Self-respect." Valerie squirmed in her chair, turning pale. Richard stood up abruptly. "This is absolute madness." "No," I replied in a low but unshakable voice. "Madness was thinking you could humiliate me and that the world would simply applaud you." He glared at me with rage. But behind that rage, there was fear. Valerie tried to interject, but I shot her a look that stopped her in her tracks. "Stay quiet. Valerie, there is nothing you can say that will change what is already done." Alexander excused himself for a few minutes. Leaving us alone, Richard rested his hands heavily on the table. "Why are you doing this?" "Dad, to humiliate me? No." "Son, to teach you." "Teach me what? To never despise the man who gave you life." He stared at me, his brow furrowed, as if he were suddenly seeing me for the very first time. His voice grew weak. "I just wanted to live my life," he muttered. "And you did," I replied, "at the cost of destroying mine. But I do not blame you. I forgive you." His eyes filled with tears. For a moment, he looked exactly like the little boy who used to ask me for help with his homework. But it was too late. The damage was done, and the lesson had been taught. Valerie stood up, completely offended. "We do not need this." Richard, let's go. Yes, I said with a smile. Go. But remember something. This house is not mine, nor is it Alexander's. It is the reflection of what a man can build when he stops waiting for others to respect him and starts respecting himself. They walked out without saying goodbye. The heavy parlor doors closed behind them with a sharp thud that sounded exactly like a cycle coming to an end. That night, Alexander came back to the dining room and found me sitting in front of the blown-out candles. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "For the first time in a long time." "Yes." He looked at me with that peaceful smile that characterized him so well. "Robert, today you did something much bigger than getting revenge. You showed them what dignity looks like." I nodded. I had not done this for the money or the power. I had done it for myself, for the man who was once thrown out onto the street with a suitcase, and who was now having dinner in his own kingdom. 3 weeks had passed since that dinner. Life on the estate remained peaceful, filled with Alexander's occasional laughter and the distant chirping of birds. I continued working alongside him, reviewing paperwork and participating in executive meetings. On the outside, everything seemed perfectly calm, but inside, I had a very clear sensation. Something inevitable was approaching, and I was not wrong. One afternoon, as the wind rustled the curtains in the study, I heard the butler's voice. "Mr. Robert, your son and Mrs. Valerie are here. They wish to speak with you." I took a deep breath. I was not surprised. I knew he would come back. The ones who hurt you almost always return, not to ask for forgiveness, but to recover whatever they believe they can still possess. "Send them in," I replied calmly. Richard walked in first. He had deep bags under his eyes, a poorly shaven beard, and the gaze of a man who had hit rock bottom. Valerie, on the other hand, tried to look flawless, though her elegance had completely lost its shine. She looked like a fogged-up mirror. "Dad," he began with a shaky voice, "I need to talk to you." "Speak," I said without getting up from my armchair. "I do not know where to start." "Start with the truth," I replied. They looked at each other. Valerie was the first to break the silence. "We know Alexander left you in charge of everything, but we feel it would not be fair if we were left out of your plans." She paused, searching for words. "Left out of your plans." What an incredibly interesting choice of words. Richard pressed his lips together. "Dad, I know I hurt you, but things spun out of control. I had debts, pressure. I made mistakes." "Mistakes?" I asked. "Is that what you call forging my signature? Mortgaging my apartment and throwing me out on the street? Sometimes people completely destroy their own lives and then try to disguise it as carelessness." "Mistakes." "You say." I stood up. "Come here. I want to show you something." I walked them over to the living room. On the mahogany table sat a black folder. I opened it slowly and spread out the documents. "Do you recognize this?" I asked, pointing to the copy of the mortgage with the forged signature. The color vanished from his face. Valerie took a step back. "Where did you get that, or rather, from whose hands?" "Richard." He started to sweat. "Dad, I—" "Calm down." I interrupted him. "I am not going to report you. I am not going to do anything to send you to prison. Not because you do not deserve it, but because it would be a total waste of time. You already have the greatest punishment of all, living with the knowledge of exactly what you are." Valerie tried to maintain her composure. "This is all a misunderstanding. Richard never wanted to hurt you. I suppose you didn't either." I fired back. "Though I perfectly remember your laughter as you were throwing me out of my own home." Her eyes flared with fury. You were a burden, she snapped, and you are an unwanted guest. I replied evenly, but look at the irony. Valerie, burdens can be lifted. Parasites just fall off on their own. The silence in the room was absolute. The only sounds were the ticking of the grandfather clock and the faint hum of the wind against the windows. Richard covered his face with his hands. I cannot take this anymore. Dad, everything fell apart for me. Valerie wants to leave me. The creditors are hunting me down. I need help. Help, I asked, staring dead into his eyes. No. Son, what you need is a memory. A memory, yes, to remember that the day you threw me out of your house, you said you never wanted to see me again. And here you are, begging on your knees in front of the very man you despised. Valerie stood up abruptly. Enough. You have no right to humiliate us. I am not humiliating you. Valerie, I replied with a chilling calm that completely disarmed her. I am simply holding up a mirror so you can see exactly who you are. Just then, Alexander walked into the room. He was holding another folder, but his gaze was completely different. Cold, distant. Robert. Is everything all right? He asked. Yes. Alexander, I am just wrapping up a pending conversation. He nodded and placed the papers on the table. Perfect, because there is something else they need to know. He looked directly at both of them. I am sick, he stated with a firm voice. It is not severe yet, but it is time to put my affairs in order, and just so there is absolutely no confusion. My entire legal succession and my corporate estate will be transferred entirely to Robert. Richard's eyes widened in pure desperation. What? That cannot be true. Yes, it can, Alexander replied. He earned my trust, my respect, and something much more valuable, my admiration. Valerie tried to force a smile. There must be some mistake. Mr. Sanders. Richard has always wanted to fix what happened. Alexander looked at her with total disdain. Regret, born out of self-interest, is worth absolutely nothing. Ma'am. Richard collapsed into the armchair, completely devoid of strength. For the first time, I saw him without a mask. He was just a lost, empty man who no longer knew who to blame. I walked over to him, placed my hand on his shoulder, and said in a low voice, I warned you. Saul, homes are built with love, not with selfishness. You chose to play with fire, and now you have to live among the ashes. His tears began to fall. Valerie backed away, looking incredibly uncomfortable and ashamed. Let's go, she said harshly. Richard did not move. He just looked up at me with bloodshot eyes and whispered, Forgive me. Dad. I watched him in silence. Even though my heart softened for a brief instant, I knew I could not go back. Forgiveness is not something you ask for. Hassan, I said with an unwavering voice, it is something you prove. When they finally left, the air in the room felt lighter. Alexander walked over and offered me his arm. Are you okay? Yes, I replied. It just hurts to realize that sometimes the cleanest mirrors show the dirtiest truths. Have you closed a door? No, I said, looking out the window. I have closed a cycle. The doors will still open, but only for those who know how to walk through them with respect. That night, I slept deeply for the very first time. No guilt, no remorse. I knew the worst was over, but something deep in my soul told me that destiny had not yet spoken its final word. Dawn broke, wrapped in a strange silence. No birds singing, no wind murmuring, just a heavy emptiness hanging in the air. That morning, I knew, before anyone even had to tell me, that something had come to an end. I walked into the study and found him there, resting in his leather armchair. His eyes were closed. His face was completely at peace, and he wore a faint smile. Alexander Sanders had slipped away during the night. No pain, no warnings, no goodbyes. For a moment, the world seemed to completely stop spinning. I walked over slowly, took his cold hand, and pressed it against my chest. "Thank you," I whispered, "for giving me back to myself before you left." The tears came on their own, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound gratitude, because he had not left me all alone. He had left me full of strength, full of dignity, and with a brand new life. Mr. Foster, the attorney, arrived right at noon. His face was serious, his tone very precise. "Robert," he told me, "Mr. Sanders left a very clear will, his entire estate, all assets, and all company shares legally passed to your name. There is absolutely no way to contest it." I nodded in silence. I did not feel joy. I only felt an immense sense of responsibility. Love, when it is truly real, is not measured in inheritances, but in what a person leaves permanently stamped on another's soul. The news spread quickly, and it was not long before the person I most dreaded hearing from arrived at the gates. My son, Richard. He showed up that very same afternoon, sweating through an unbuttoned shirt, his eyes completely red with rage. He walked into the house without knocking. "So now all of this belongs to you," he yelled. The old man's entire fortune, too. I looked at him in total silence. Not a single word, just my absolute calm. The exact kind of calm that always drove him insane. "Answer me." "Dad," he demanded, slamming his fist on the mahogany desk. "You have no idea how to handle that kind of money. It does not belong to you." I slowly stood up from the chair, walked around the desk until I was standing right in front of him, and looking directly into his eyes. I spoke in a low, unwavering voice. "Do you even realize what you just said? It does not belong to me. You said the exact same thing about my apartment, about my life, about my dignity. But look closely. So, life turns around. And now you are standing in the exact same place where you left me." He took a step back. His lips started to tremble. "I only wanted what was best for everyone," he muttered. "No, Richard, you wanted what was best for yourself." I walked over to the window. The gardens looked gray and restless, as if they were remembering too. I turned back to face him. "Do you remember when you screamed at me to grab my suitcase and get out of your house? I did not cry because I was leaving. I cried because I realized I had raised you without teaching you the most essential thing, the value of a father. I did not cry because I was leaving. I cried because I realized I had raised you without teaching you the most essential thing, the value of a father." His eyes filled with tears. "Forgive me, Dad." I watched him in silence. Although my heart softened for a brief instant, I knew I could not go back. "Forgiveness is not something you ask for." "Aye, son," I said in a firm voice. "It is something you prove." When they left, the air seemed lighter. Alexander walked over and offered me his arm. "Are you okay?" "Yes," I replied. "It just hurts to realize that sometimes the cleanest mirrors show the dirtiest truths." "Have you closed a door?" "No," I said, looking out the window. "I have closed a cycle. The doors will still open, but only for those who know how to walk through them with respect." And that night, I slept deeply for the first time, without guilt or remorse. I knew the worst was behind me, but something in my soul told me that destiny had not yet said its final word. Dawn arrived covered in a strange silence. No birds singing, No whispering wind, just a void that weighed on the air. That morning I knew, before anyone told me, that something had ended. I entered the study and found him there, leaning back in the armchair, his eyes closed, his face at peace, and a faint smile on his lips. Alexander Sanders had passed away during the night. No pain, no warnings, no goodbyes. For an instant, the world seemed to stop. I approached slowly, took his cold hand, and pressed it against my chest. "Thank you," I whispered, "for giving me back to myself before you left." The tears came on their own, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, because he had not left me alone, but filled with strength, dignity, and a new life. The attorney arrived at noon. His face was serious, his tone precise. "Robert," he told me, "Mr. Sanders left a very clear will. His entire estate, assets, and shares legally passed to your name. There is no way to contest it." I nodded in silence. I felt no joy, only an immense responsibility. Love, when it is true, is not measured in inheritances, but in what one leaves in the soul of another. The news spread quickly, and it was not long before the one I most feared hearing it arrived. My son, Richard. He arrived that very afternoon, sweating through his unbuttoned shirt, his eyes red with rage. He entered without knocking. "So now all this is yours," he said, almost shouting. "The old man's entire fortune, too." I looked at him in silence. No words, only my calm, the one that always drove him to despair. "Answer me, Dad," he insisted, striking the table. "You do not know how to manage that money. It does not belong to you." Then I stood up slowly, walked until I was standing in front of him, and looking directly into his eyes, I said in a low but firm voice, "Do you realize what you just said? It does not belong to me. You said the same thing about my apartment, my life, my dignity. But look, son, life turns around, and now you are in the place where you left me." He took a step back. His lips trembled. "I just wanted the best for everyone," he muttered. "No, Richard, you wanted what was best for you." I walked to the window. The gardens were gray, restless, as if they too remembered. I turned to him. "Do you know when you screamed, 'Take your suitcase and get out of my house'? I did not cry about leaving. I cried when I realized that I had raised you without teaching you the essential, the value of a father." His eyes filled with tears. "Forgive me, Dad. I still cannot forgive you," I replied softly, "but I can teach you what it feels like." I stared at him with a calmness that disarmed him. "Take your suitcase." "Richard, what? What are you saying? Take your suitcase," I repeated, "and get out of my house." He froze. "Are you kicking me out?" "No. I am just returning the lesson you gave me." The silence was absolute. I could hear the creaking of the wood under his feet. His hands began to tremble. "I have nowhere to go." "Neither did I," I said, walking toward the door. "But I left anyway." When he crossed the threshold, he stopped and looked at me with cloudy eyes. "Does this make you happy?" "Dad, no. Isn't," I replied. "Happiness is not in seeing you fall, but in seeing myself standing." I closed the door gently. Through the glass, I heard him walk away dragging a small backpack. He did not turn around. I did not either. I went to the living room and lit a candle for Alexander. The flame trembled, as if the air had been filled with memories. "I did it," I whispered. "What you wanted!" I reclaimed my place. The butler entered and handed me an envelope. This was on Mr. Alexander's desk with your name on it. Sir, I opened it. It was a letter. Robert, if you are reading this, I am gone. Do not cry for me. Death does not steal anything from me. It just changes my place. Take care of what you built, but above all, take care of yourself. From the forgiveness you give too easily and the love you do not know how to deny. Money passes. Dignity remains. Tears blurred my vision. This letter was his final gift. A warning and a blessing. That night, the wind battered the windows. The gardens roared as if wanting to tear everything down. I sat in front of the fire with the letter on my knees. I thought about Richard, Valerie, everything I had lived through, and I understood that revenge, when it arrives with elegance, does not destroy, it teaches. Alexander had left me much more than property. He had left me my voice, my power, my center. I blew out the candle with a sigh. The fire went out. But something inside me remained lit. The certainty that I would never again be the man who could be expelled from his own home. If you love this story, you can support Grandfather's advice by sending a super thanks. I thank you infinitely for your support. Leave your comments. I look forward to reading them. Several months had passed since Alexander's death. Winter had settled into the region, and the wind brought a cold that ached in the bones. But it purified the air. The house was quiet, as if it too had learned to live with his absence. My days were spent between work, reading, and walks in the garden. I had found something many seek their whole lives: peace. Until that afternoon, when the sound of the doorbell broke the calm. The butler appeared at the parlor door. Mr. Robert, he said in a hushed voice, there is a woman who insists on seeing you. She does not want to leave. Who is it? I asked. She says her name is Valerie. The name hit me like a piece of ice. For an instant, I thought about saying I was not here, but then I took a deep breath. The moment had arrived. The moment to close the final wound. Show her in, I said with a firm voice. The door opened, and there she was. Valerie. She was no longer the arrogant and haughty woman who had looked at me with contempt. Her face was dejected, her makeup poorly applied, her hair neglected. She wore a worn-out coat, and her eyes were empty, no shine, no arrogance. She was just a shadow of herself. Robert, she said in a threat of a voice, forgive me for coming like this without warning. Do not worry. I replied calmly. She entered slowly, looking around as if she could not believe that the same man she wanted to wipe off the map was now living in a place like this. We sat across from each other, me in my usual armchair, and her on the edge of hers. Nervous, I need your help, she started, without beating around the bush. My heart tightened. Richard has disappeared. Disappeared. Yes. He left weeks ago. He had trouble with dangerous people. He lost everything, even the apartment. And I... Her voice failed. I have nowhere to live. The silence became dense. I watched her without saying anything. Every word was like a piece that fit into the puzzle of destiny's justice. She, who had once laughed while expelling me from my home, was now begging for a roof. And what do you expect from me? Valerie, I asked with serenity. Just a place to stay. Not for long. Until I can start over. I looked at her. Her hands were shaking. Her lips cracked. Her eyes pleading. For a moment I felt compassion. But the memory of her voice on that fateful day, you are going to ruin the photos with your old man. Medicine smell returned like a slap. I took a deep breath. Do you remember when you told me that a house was not a place for useless old men? I asked softly. Robert, I was wrong. I know. I know. But words, like stones, leave marks. She remained silent, her eyes filled with tears. Please, she whispered, I have no one else. I looked at her for a long time, not with hatred, but with a calmness that only the years bring. Life, I thought, is a cruel but just teacher, and this woman had already learned her lesson. I stood up slowly, walked to the window. The gardens were gray and turbulent, like that afternoon when Alexander died. And looking at the horizon, I spoke without turning. I cannot offer you a home, Valerie, but I can offer you something worth more. What? She asked, almost inaudible. The same advice you gave me one day, although with other words, learn to start over alone. She lowered her head. Defeated, she stood up with effort and walked to the door. Before leaving, she stopped. You know, I always believed you were weak, that your silence was cowardice. I turned and looked her in the eyes. You were wrong, Valerie. My silence was patience, and patience always collects its price. She opened the door with trembling hands. The garden wind blew in, cold as a reminder. She looked at me one last time and whispered, I hope that someday you can forgive me. I hope so too, I replied. But it must be earned. And then she left, without looking back, disappearing down the gravel path in her coat, floating in the wind like a surrendered flag. I stood watching the closed door for a long time. I felt no joy. I felt no pity, just a strange sense of relief, as if a shadow had been lifted from my chest after years of living there. I went out to the garden. The birds sang in the trees. Furious, but beautiful. I thought of Richard. Where was he? Was he alive? A father's heart never stops beating for a son, even when it has been wounded. My God. I whispered to the wind, take care of him wherever he is, and if one day he returns, may he come with a clean soul. The wind blew harder, and in that moment I felt something like an answer. It was not comfort, it was a closure, because I had understood that justice, when it comes from the heart, needs no witnesses. That night I lit the fireplace. The fire illuminated the walls, and Alexander's portrait seemed to smile at me from the back of the room. I took a glass of wine, sat in front of the fire, and for the first time I thought neither about the past nor revenge, only about the silence, a silence that this time did not hurt. It was the sound of peace. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment from what city you are watching us. Your support makes all the difference. Time passed without warning. The days became slower, the gardens more serene, and winter began to surrender to spring. The house was no longer a refuge of sadness, but of calm. I had learned to live alone, without resentment, without fear, without expecting anything from anyone. But one afternoon, as the sun hid and the sky turned golden, the butler approached with a pale face. Mr. Robert, he said in almost a whisper, there is someone who insists on seeing you. He says he is your son. My heart skipped a beat. I felt my body go numb, as if suddenly the entire past gathered in a single second. Send him in, I said, trying to keep my voice firm. Richard entered slowly. But he was no longer the arrogant man who had screamed at me years ago. His face was aged, his skin pale, his steps clumsy. He held a cane in his hand and had a cough that sounded like a farewell. His sunken eyes were those of someone who had lost more than money. He had lost life itself. Dad, he whispered. My name in his mouth sounded different. There was no rage or pride, Only exhaustion and a silent plea. I remained motionless, watching him in silence. I did not know if I should run to hug him or stand firm, but he approached, fell to his knees in front of me, and began to cry. "Forgive me. Dad, please, forgive me." Those tears were real, different from the other times. He cried like a lost child. And in that moment I understood that he was no longer my enemy, but a soul defeated by his own mistakes. I leaned over, took his face in my hands, and said with a trembling voice, "I do not know if I can forgive you for everything, son, but I can love you, even if you no longer have time to change the past." He cried harder. "I have been sick," he confessed. "The doctor says I do not have much time left, and I just wanted to see you one last time." My eyes filled with tears. "Why did you wait so long?" I asked. "Because shame weighs more than pain." I helped him up and led him to the armchair by the fire. I served him some tea. His hands trembled as he held the cup. The silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was necessary. Every second that passed seemed to slowly erase the shouting, the tears, the abandonment. "What happened to Valerie?" I asked after a moment. "She went to another region. I never heard from her again." I nodded. Destiny does not forgive arrogance. But I felt no joy at her downfall, only compassion. Richard looked at me and smiled weakly. "You know, Dad, when I saw you get into that limousine, I hated you." "Why?" "Because I knew in that instant that I would never be stronger than you." Those words pierced my heart. I did not know whether to laugh or cry. Life is like that. We spend decades waiting for a recognition that only comes when we no longer need it. We spent hours talking. He told me what he had lived through after I kicked him out. The sleepless nights, the failed businesses, the alcohol, the loneliness. Each story was a piece of the punishment life had already imposed on him without my intervention. When he finished, I looked at him steadily and said, "Life took everything you thought was yours to give you back, the only thing you had forgotten to take care of your soul." He nodded, crying again. "I just want you to know that I regret it, Dad, not for having lost the money, but for having lost you." I leaned over and hugged him. "You did not lose me, Richard. You just walked away. But children always return, even if it is at the end." That night, Richard slept in the guest room. I covered him with a blanket and sat by his side for a long while, watching his weak breathing, his serene face. It was as if time had finally caught up with him. Before closing his eyes, he looked at me and whispered, "Thank you. Dad, you are welcome. In I did, for not letting you hate me." When dawn came, he was no longer breathing. His face was incredibly at peace. I took his hand and, through tears, whispered, "Now, Sant, now you can rest." The funeral was simple. No expensive flowers or fake speeches. Just the sound of birds accompanying the farewell. As the coffin was lowered, I felt something release within me. It was not relief. It was forgiveness. The true kind. The kind that does not erase the pain but transforms it into understanding. I returned to the house at sunset, lit the fireplace, and looked at the fire. I remembered Alexander's letter, Richard's tears, Valerie's words. Everything fit. Everything had had a purpose. I poured myself a glass of wine, raised my eyes toward Alexander's portrait, and whispered, "Everything returns, my dear friend. Even the love we gave without expecting anything." The gardens roared outside, serene, eternal, and I felt their sound embrace me. For the first time, I felt neither like a victim nor an avenger. Just a man, just a father, just alive. If this story has touched you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what you think. Your support is essential for me to keep bringing you stories like this. Today I know that life is not measured by what we lose, but by what we learn to let go of. Forgiving is not giving up, it is regaining control of your soul. And although justice comes late, it always comes. Time takes care of putting every heart in its place. Now that everything has passed, I look back and it seems incredible to me. The man I was and the one I am. I was a father, husband, shadow, et silence. I was the man everyone judged weak, the one no one defended, the one who left his house with a suitcase and an empty soul. But I was also the one who learned to be reborn without asking for permission. Today I understand that time does not remove wounds, but makes them wise. I learned that there is no harder punishment than conscience, no more elegant revenge than dignity, and that sometimes forgiveness is not for others, but to be able to keep walking without the weight of resentment. I close my eyes, listen to the birds, and smile, because in the end, they did not expel me from my house. They pushed me toward my freedom. The months that followed Richard's death were strange. I did not feel the emptiness I expected, but something more complex, a mixture of peace and melancholy. Like when a storm ends and the air is clean but humid, the house remained my refuge. I continued working with the businesses Alexander had left me, making decisions, meeting with partners, managing properties. I had become what I never imagined, a respected businessman. But the nights were different. At night, when the silence filled everything, I would sit on the balcony with a glass of wine and remember. I remembered Richard as a child. When he asked me to tell him stories before sleeping, I remembered Evelyn, her hard-working hands, her tired but loving gaze. I remembered even the bad days, the humiliations, the nights crying in silence, all that had brought me here. One afternoon, while reviewing documents, I found something among Alexander's papers, a yellowish envelope with my name written by hand. I opened it carefully. Inside was an old photograph. In it, Alexander and I appeared, young, sitting on a bench in Central Park. We must have been about 25 years old. We were smiling as if the world were ours. Behind the photo, in trembling handwriting, it said, "Robert, I kept this for 40 years waiting for the moment to give it back to you. I never forgot you. I never stopped looking for you. And when I found you, I knew that destiny had given me one last opportunity to do the right thing, to return your dignity to you. Love is not always romantic. Sometimes it is simply recognizing in the other what the world could not see. Thank you for letting me be part of your rebirth." Ah, the tears fell on the paper. They were not tears of sadness, but of infinite gratitude. Alexander had not only saved me, he had seen me. He had recognized me when I had forgotten myself. I kept the photograph in my wallet, next to my father's pocket watch and Evelyn's letters. They were my treasures. They had no monetary value, but they were worth more than all the gold in the world. That night I dreamed of Alexander. We were in the garden, walking among the flowers. He looked at me with that calm smile he always had. Did I do the right thing? I asked in the dream. There is no right or wrong. Robert, he replied, there is only what brings you back to yourself. I woke up with the dawn. The dream felt so real that for a moment I believed we had really spoken. I got up, got dressed, and went down to the garden. The gardeners were already working, pruning the rose bushes, watering the plants. They greeted me with respect. "Good morning, Mr. Robert," Good morning, boys. I walked among the flowers, touching the petals with my fingertips. Everything was alive, growing, renewing itself. That was life. Cycles that ended and others that began. I thought of Richard. Was he at peace? Had he really forgiven me? I would never know. But what I did know was that I had forgiven him, and that forgiveness was not for him, but for me, because carrying the weight of hatred is like walking with stones in your pockets. You only sink deeper. One day, while checking the mail, a letter arrived. It had no return address, only my name on the envelope. I opened it with curiosity. Mr. Robert, I do not know if you remember me. I am Lucy, the neighbor who lived in your son's building. I am writing to tell you something I think you should know. When Richard got sick, before he left, he came to my apartment. He was very thin, very tired. He asked me a favor if I ever saw you. I should tell you he was truly sorry. He said, "Tell my dad. I learned too late what it means to have a real father. Tell him I wish I had had the courage to say it sooner." He cried a lot that day. I think you deserve to know that your son did repent, even if he did not always know how to show it. With affection, Lucy. I read the letter 3 times. Each time, the words hurt me less and healed me more. Richard had changed. Maybe not enough, maybe too late. But he had tried, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. I kept the letter next to Alexander's photograph. My treasures kept growing. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Life continued its natural course. I hired a cook who made the best pies in the region. I told her that on Sundays she should always prepare extra, because I started inviting the employees, the gardeners, the people from town to eat with me. The house that had been a lonely refuge was filled with laughter, stories, life. Mr. Carmichael, the head gardener, told me stories of the war his grandfather had told him. Mrs. Rose, the cook, made me laugh with her market gossip. The partners came to meetings, but they also stayed for dinner, to talk, to share. I realized something important. Wealth was not in the money I had, but in the people surrounding me. One afternoon, while we were all eating in the patio, Mr. Carmichael raised his glass and said, "A toast to Mr. Robert, the man who taught us that it is never too late to start over." Everyone raised their glasses. I felt a lump in my throat. "No, Mr. Carmichael," I said, "the toast is for all of you," who reminded me that family is not always of blood. We toasted, and in that moment, surrounded by people who appreciated me for who I was and not for what I had, I understood that I had gained something more valuable than revenge. I had gained my own self-esteem. One night, while organizing the study, I found the notebook where I had written my story months ago. I opened it and read one day. "The son who threw me out of my house will learn what it means to be homeless." I took a pen en masse. Under that sentence, I wrote, and when he learned it, I had already learned something bigger, that home is not a place, but a state of the soul. I closed the notebook and put it in a drawer. I did not need it anymore. That story had ended. A new one was beginning. The wind blew gently through the open windows. The scent of jasmine filled the study. I leaned back in the armchair where I had so often seen Alexander sitting, making decisions, looking at the horizon. "Thank you, old friend," I whispered to the air, "for believing in me when I did not believe in myself." The wind blew harder, like an answer, and for the first time in many years I felt complete. not because I had money or property or power, but because I had something no one could take from me, my recovered dignity, my soul at peace, my heart open to whatever might come. Life had taken much from me, but it had also given me everything, and that, at the end of the day, was more than enough. I got up from the chair, turned off the lights in the study, and went out to the balcony. The moon was full, illuminating the gardens with a silvery light. The birds were sleeping in the trees. The world was silent, and I, Robert, the man who had been expelled from his house with a suitcase, was now standing in his own palace, not out of revenge, not out of hatred, but out of justice, out of dignity, out of self-love. I smiled at the starry sky, and before entering, I whispered, "This is just the beginning," because I knew that I still had one last thing to do, something that would close the cycle once and for all, something that destiny had been preparing from the beginning. But that would be for tomorrow, tonight. I just wanted to sleep in peace. And I did. For the first time in decades, I slept without nightmares, without fears, without guilt. I slept like the free man I had finally become again. The next day dawned with a clear sky. The sun's rays entered through the window like fingers of light, touching every corner of the room. I got up early as always, but this time with a different feeling. Something had changed during the night, not in the outside world, but within me. I showered, got dressed in my best suit, the same dark blue one I had worn to dinner with Richard and Valerie, and went down to breakfast. Mrs. Rose was already in the kitchen, preparing coffee and pastries. "Good morning, Mr. Robert." She greeted me with her warm smile. "You look very elegant today. Do you have an important meeting, yes?" "Mrs. Rose," I replied. "The most important of all." She looked at me curiously, but did not ask more. She had learned to respect my silences. I had breakfast slowly, savoring every bite, every sip of coffee, as if it were the first time I ate in that house, or perhaps the last. After breakfast, I called the lawyer. "Mr. Foster, I need you to prepare some documents," I told him. "Of course. Mr. Robert, what is it about?" "I want to establish a foundation to help elderly people who have been abandoned by their families. I want it to carry the name of Alexander Sanders." There was silence on the other end of the line. "It seems like a beautiful idea. Mr. Robert," he finally said in an emotional voice. "Mr. Sanders would be very proud." "I hope so." "Mr. Foster." "I hope so." I spent the next few hours discussing the details. The foundation would offer decent housing, medical care, companionship, and above all, respect to older people who had been discarded by their own children, because I knew what that was like. I had lived it, and if my story served to change even one life, then everything, the pain, the humiliation, the weeping would have been worth it. In the afternoon, I received an unexpected call. "Mr. Robert?" asked an unknown voice. "Yes, this is me. My name is Gabrielle Reynolds. I am a social worker. I am calling because we have a woman here who says she knows you. Her name is Valerie. She is in a very delicate situation and mentioned your name." My heart tightened. "What happened?" "She is sick, Mr. To Robert, advanced stage cancer. She has no family, no resources. She is at General Hospital and, well, she asked for you." I closed my eyes. Destiny. Once again, put things in their place. "I am on my way," I said. General Hospital was a large and sad building, full of cold hallways and the smell of disinfectant. I found Valerie's room on the third floor. When I entered, I barely recognized her. The haughty and elegant woman I had known was now a fragile body in a bed, connected to tubes and machines. Her hair had disappeared from chemotherapy. Her skin was gray. But her eyes, those eyes that had looked at me with contempt, now looked at me with a plea. "Robert," she whispered. "You came." I approached and pulled a chair up next to the bed. "I came," I said simply. Tears began to roll down her cheeks. "You do not have to be here. I know I do not deserve your compassion." "No," I replied softly, "but I deserve my own peace." She closed her eyes. "I am dying," she said. "The doctors say I have weeks, maybe days. I am sorry. Valerie, do not be sorry. It is what I deserve. No one deserves to die alone and in pain." I said, "Not even you." She looked at me, surprised. "Why are you so good to me? After everything I did to you, because I am not being good to you." "Valerie, I am being good to myself. Resentment is a poison that only kills the one who drinks it." She remained silent. Only the beeping of the machines could be heard. "Do you know what I regret the most?" she finally asked. "Not treating you poorly. That was terrible." "Yes, but what I regret most is not having learned sooner what you knew all along." "What thing?" "That dignity cannot be bought. It is built with every decision you make." I smiled sadly. "We all learn at our own pace, Valerie. Some faster, others slower. But in the end, we all arrive at the same place." I took her hand. It was cold. "Bonnie, I am not going to leave you alone." I told her, "I am going to make sure you have everything you need. The best doctors, to the best care. And when the time comes, you will have a dignified farewell." She cried in silence. They were not tears of self-pity, but of gratitude. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you helping me?" "Because someone helped me when no one else would. And I learned that kindness is not weakness. It is the greatest strength that exists." I stayed with her all afternoon. I told her about the foundation I was creating, the plans I had, the life I had built. And, for the first time, I saw something different in her eyes. Admiration. Not the hollow admiration I had seen in Richard's eyes when he discovered my fortune, but the genuine admiration of someone who recognizes true greatness. When I stood up to leave, she told me, "Robert, if there is another life after this one, I hope to be a better person." "Like you?" I said. "Not like me, Valerie. Like the best version of yourself." I left the hospital with a heavy but peaceful heart. I knew that I would soon receive the call. I knew that Valerie did not have much time, but I also knew that I had done the right thing. Not for her. For me. A week later, Valerie passed away. I paid for the funeral. Simple but dignified. The social worker, some nurses who had taken care of her, and I were present. As she was lowered in the casket, I thought of the irony of it all. The woman who had kicked me out of my house was now being seen off by me. But I felt no victory. Only sadness for a life wasted on appearances and vanity. Rest in peace. "Valerie," I whispered, "I hope you find up there what you could not find down here." Months passed. The Alexander Sanders Foundation opened its doors in a beautiful house on the outskirts of the city. On the day of the inauguration, authorities, journalists, and people from the town came. But the most important thing was seeing the first residents arrive, abandoned elderly people who finally found a home. Mr. Martin, a 7, 8-year old man whose daughter had left him on the street. Mrs. Louisa, an 2-year-old woman who had lived in a horrible nursing home where they abused her. Mr. Philip, an 5-year-old man whose children had fought over his pension and forgotten him. Seeing them enter with tears of gratitude, with shy smiles, with renewed hope, I knew that my life had found its purpose. It was not just giving them a roof, it was giving them back their dignity. At the inauguration ceremony, they asked me to say a few words. I stood in front of the microphone and looked at all those faces, the elderly, the volunteers, the press, the authorities. A long time ago, I began. I was one of them. My son expelled me from my house with a suitcase. I was left homeless, without dignity, without hope. There was total silence. But life gave me a second chance. A friend, Alexander Sanders, held out his hand when no one else would. He reminded me of who I was. He gave me back my dignity. I saw that some of the elderly were nodding, with tears in their eyes. They understood. This foundation is my way of paying that debt. Not to Alexander, because he is no longer here, but to life. And to all of you who are here today, I paused. I want you to know something very important. You are not a burden. You are not a nuisance. You are not disposable. You are living treasures. You are history, wisdom, experience. And you deserve to be treated with the respect and love that every person deserves. The applause was deafening. I saw Mr. Martin wipe his tears with a handkerchief. I saw Mrs. Louise smile for the first time, and in that moment I knew I had won. Not against Richard, not against Valerie, not against anyone. I had won against oblivion, against bitterness, against the temptation to become what they had been. That night, back at the estate, I sat in the study with a glass of wine. I looked at Alexander's portrait. We did it. Old man, I said, your name will live forever, not in property or money, but in changed lives. The wind blew gently, moving the curtains, and I swear I heard his voice, clear as day. It was not my name, Robert, it was your heart. I smiled. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was real. It did not matter. What mattered was that I had closed the circle. 6 months later, I received a letter. The envelope was simple, with no return address. I opened it with curiosity. Inside was a photo and a handwritten note. The photo showed a young man, perhaps 30 years old, with a wide smile. He looked like Richard. The note said, Mr. Robert, my name is Michael Mendoza. I am Richard Mendoza's son, your grandson. I know you do not know me, because my father and I distanced ourselves years ago, before he died. I just found out about your existence and the whole story. I want to meet you. I want to know who my grandfather is. If you allow it, I would like to visit you, with respect and hope. Michael. I stared at the photo for a long time. I had a grandson who wanted to meet me. Destiny, once again, surprised me. I took paper and pen and wrote Michael. Of course you can come. This house is also yours. It always was. Your grandfather, Robert. A week later, Michael knocked on my door. He was tall, light-eyed, with his father's smile, but with something different in his gaze. Kindness. We hugged. It was a strange hug at first, between two strangers sharing blood. But little by little, it became real, genuine, healing. We spent days talking. I told him the whole story, the expulsion, the limousine, Alexander, the revenge that turned into justice, Richard's death, the foundation. He listened to everything without judging. He just listened. My father spoke to me about you before he died, he said. He told me one afternoon. He told me he had committed the worst mistake of his life, that the only good thing he had left was knowing that his father had forgiven him. And you? I asked. What do you think of all this? Michael looked me in the eyes. I think you are the strongest man I have ever known, not because of money or power, but because you chose forgiveness over hatred. And that, grandfather, is true greatness. Grandfather, that word sounded like music. Do you know what? Michael, I said, all these years I thought my story was about revenge, justice, recovered dignity, but I was wrong. What was it about then? About second chances. And you are mine. His eyes filled with tears. And you are mine. Grandfather, today, as I write these lines in the same study where so many decisions were made, I look out the window and see Michael playing with the employees' grandchildren in the garden. I hear their laughter. I see the future. And I understand that life is a circle. What you give comes back. What you sow, you reap. What you forgive, frees you. My son expelled me from his house. Yes, but by doing so, he pushed me toward my destiny. The limousine was not just a vehicle. It was a symbol that we are never as lost as we think. Alexander was not just a friend. He was an angel disguised as a businessman. And Richard was not just an ungrateful son. He was my harshest teacher, the one who taught me that self-love is not selfishness, but survival. Today I am 75 years old. I have a foundation that has helped more than 200 elderly people. I have a grandson who comes to visit me every weekend. I have employees who are my family. I have peace. And the money is just paper. What counts are the lives you touch, the hearts you heal, the legacy you leave. To all those reading this, to all who have been rejected, humiliated, abandoned, I want to say something. You are not the end of your story. You are the beginning of your rebirth. Dignity is not given to you by others. You give it to yourself with every decision you make. Forgiveness is not for the one who hurt you. It is so you can sleep in peace. And self-love is not vanity. It is the foundation on which you build everything else. If I could stand up, you can too. If I could forgive, you can too. If I could find peace after the storm, you can too. I close this chapter of my life with gratitude. Gratitude for the blows that strengthened me, for the falls that taught me how to get up, for the tears that washed my soul, and above all, gratitude for the limousine that arrived just when I needed it most. Because sometimes, when everything seems lost, destiny has a way of reminding you. Your story is not over. It is just beginning. Epilogue 10 years later. On my 85th birthday, the foundation organized a party in the estate garden. Everyone was there, the current and former residents, the volunteers, Michael with his wife and children, my great-grandchildren, Mrs. Rose, Mr. Carmichael, Mr. Foster, authorities, friends. Someone had hung a sign that said, "Thank you, Mr. Robert, for teaching us that it is never too late to start over." When they asked me to blow out the candles on the cake, I closed my eyes and made a wish. I did not ask for more money. I did not ask for more time. I did not ask for revenge or justice. I asked that everyone who felt rejected, abandoned, or lost would find their own limousine, their own second chance, their own Alexander. I blew out the candles. Everyone applauded, and while I was cutting the cake, surrounded by love and laughter, I looked toward the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Richard. Thank you to life." Because in the end, they had all been necessary. They had all been part of the plan. And I, Robert, the man who was expelled from his house with a suitcase, was now surrounded by more family than I had ever dreamed of, not of blood, but of the heart, and that, I discovered, was the best family of all.